like to think of myself as providing side-splitting action and comedy to the world in my comics.
You do.
And I'll tell you what's been happening to me in my own personal life is pants-splitting action in my own life. I have, this is no joke. In the past 3 weeks, I've split no less than 3 pairs of pants.
Really?
And here's why I feel like this is unjust the universe is doing to this to me. In the past, I don't know, 8 months, I'm down 25 pounds, right?
Wow.
So if anything,
impressive.
my pants should be like thanking me.
Yeah.
And yet I was telling my wife, I'm like, all my pants are splitting on me. As like I'm currently shipping out a bunch of drive books, so I'm doing a lot of bending and squatting and lifting and turning, and every time it's like, my pants are splitting. And I go to my wife, I'm like, I'm losing weight. Why are my pants splitting? And she goes, listen, Cheapy McGee, it's because you haven't bought new pants in like 5 years. It's not because of a weight issue. These pants are giving up the ghost. That's what's happening.
Yeah, the last time you bought pants, George Bush was in office. The first one.
Yeah, Operation Desert Storm was what I considered that trip to Sears. Yeah, exactly. So I finally, I think, Brad, I have to break down and buy myself new pants. It's been a wonderful 5 to 10 year journry that I've had with these slacks, and it's time to get new ones.
That would be so great if we look in your drawer and there's all these jeans brand that have been, that aren't making jeans anymore. Like, oh yeah, these are my favorite pair of Jordache jeans, man.
Sure, yeah, it's all like the Mervyn's brands from the 80s that no longer exist.
Yeah. I've never seen jeans by Oshkosh Bagosh.
Yeah, wow, I didn't know that Theodore Roosevelt personally sewed pants. That's interesting. All right. And on that note, everybody, I want to say hello, everybody, and welcome to Pants Splitting Action with Comic Lab, the show about making comics.
I guess Betsy Ross did more than flags and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Guigar, the editor of the Webcomics Handbook on Substack and the creator of Evil Inc.
Betsy Ross, just to point out, such a better joke because A, it's older, and B, she actually had a sewing angle to her life, unlike Theodore Roosevelt. What the hell was I going for? I'm his friend Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this week's hour of comics advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We've got a fun show for everybody. Brad and I were talking over the topics for this week's show just before we hit record on the mics. And I am excited for this episode, Bradley.
Yeah, we've got some really good stuff coming up. And we've got a really simple question that came in from our Comic Lab backer, George. It's short and sweet, and it's a great question. Just listen to this. When does a recurring joke become a trope? In other words, when does it become too much?
A recurring joke, a running gag, is another way to say it, right?
Yeah, like if you introduce a gag, and typically this is a comic strip thing, but you can see it in comic books as well. You've got a punchline, and then later on, boom, you've got it again. It's a callback. And then you do it a third or fourth time. Now it becomes a running gag. Now it's a thing. When does that go beyond funny? When do you start running it into the ground?
Boy, that is what a great question for being so simple. Let's talk about some times where a running gag or a visual runner was used again and again, just so people have a reference. To me, the classic comic running gags are probably in Peanuts, because I can think of at least 5 or 6 right off the bat that Schultz, over, let's be honest, 50 years, I think he was working consistently. Yeah. Of course, you're going to go back to the well a couple of times. And so he had the kite-eating tree. He had the pulling away of the football. He had, what other running gags did he have? Psychiatrist is in. Granted, that's more of a setting, but it was also, sort of tropish.
There was Snoopy tapping on his typewriter. Being a novelist, it was a dark and stormy night.
Right. And so what purpose do they serve? Well, for one, especially with a comic strip, it's hard to come up with completely new stuff all the time. So if you had something that worked, and you got a bunch of reader letters, and that's what Schultz would have gotten back in the day, that said, oh my God, I loved that, the idea of Lucy pulling away the football.
Right.
And even separate from that, you as a cartoonist love doing it. It makes you happy. And you're like, I'd love to use that again. I see more fertile ground that I could go with that. You go back to it, and that's fine. Like we've all done it. I've done it. Brad's done it. Scott Kurtz did it with the panda attacks on PvP.
I was going to bring that up because, and I I don't know whether I'm being pedantic or not, or pedantic, whichever one is the correct. I don't know whether I'm being mincing hairs here. Scott Kurtz, when he did the Attack Panda, which every now and again there'd be something completely different happening, and then out of nowhere a panda would show up in the fourth panel and attack somebody, and the attacking panda was a running gag. In that was the gag that ended the strip. My question to you is, if we're going to go down on this topic, to go down this rabbit hole, is there a difference between a running gag like the Attack Panda and a repeated concept or a repeated theme like the psychiatrist booth or pulling away the football or Dark and Stormy Night? I'm wondering whether that's a recurring theme as opposed to a running gag.
I'm glad you're clarifying that, because yes, you're right. The psychiatrist is a recurring theme, recurring setting rather.
Yeah.
The football being pulled away is a running gag, because that was always fourth panel. And the setup was always hope springs eternal. Maybe she won't do it this time.
Right.
Bada bing, bada boom. The running gag. The punchline is, no, she did it again. Right.
Yeah.
So that's a running gag.
I could go along with that.
And part of this is because the question asker George had asked about tropes.
Yeah.
Which are repeated themes, repeated settings. Very often can be trope-ish. And honestly, at this point, it's hard to separate what for Schulz was a repeated setting versus what we now see as tropish, because it was 50 years of established Peanuts. And so it's hard to separate that from it, you know. And I'll just out of the completely side note, do you find Peanuts funny? Just complete side note.
No. I always had a really conflicted relationship with Peanuts, especially when I was in the early 2000s, when I first started publishing webcomics myself. And at that time, remember, the internet hadn't completely taken over. So I still wanted to be a newspaper cartoonist. And I was really upset because I saw it, and I was right. It was a zero-sum game. There was only so much space on the newspaper comics page. And it really kind of bothered me that Peanuts was there because Peanuts was always there. And I rarely found it funny. In fact, somebody once made the comment that it really resonated with me, that it's not like Peanuts had a great sense of humor. Peanuts had a philosophy, and we appreciated being exposed to that philosophy on a daily basis. It wasn't funny like Bloom County or Calvin and Hobbes or The Far Side or any of those comics from that heyday where I fell in love with newspaper comics. It was more philosophical, and that's where it got its strength. As I've matured a little bit as an individual, I I have a new appreciation for it. But as a young person, Peanuts kind of got under my skin.
Yeah, I don't know that I know that makes a lot of cartoonists angry if I say that, but I don't know that I ever found Peanuts funny. There's great familiarity for me in my heart. There's a resonance of joy there. And I always found it sweet, and I always found it endearing. I don't know that I ever found it funny, which I don't think is unfair to Schulz. He was going for a certain thing. And I don't know. It sounds cruel to say that, because here is 50 years of Schulz, and he impacted hundreds of millions of lives around the planet and had spaceships named after Snoopy and all sorts of stuff, like an amazing impact. But I never found it funny. But anyway, okay, completely separate from that. So running gags. So how do you know when to cut them off? When is too much too much? And here, this is not a given, but I'm going to somewhat compare it to the rule of threes, and then I'm going to extend out from that. So the rule of threes is establishment of a precedent, reinforcement of a precedent, breaking of the precedent on the third time, and that's the joke, right?
Yeah.
And in a lot of comedy, three seems to come up a lot, separate from the rule of threes, right? And so in general, I would say if you're using a running gag in very parallel or right on following on pages in a comic book, I would not go past three. A reader will allow for 3 in subsequent pages. But beyond that, I feel like just as a bare rule of thumb, that's not even a hard and fast rule. It's just like as a laying down a line. But I'll tell you where running gags get an advantage in comic strips or even in comic books is if you go back to the running gag after enough time. Because we talked about with tragedy and comedy last week or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Time is a unique weapon in comedy. And so if you use a thing too much in too much frequency over a couple of comic strips right in a row or a couple of pages right in a row, the overbearingness of it makes it unfunny. But the addition of time oddly makes things funny again. And what's weird about that is that you also have it if you go too far in using something too many times, like Family Guy does.
Yeah.
And then you use it so much that it then comes back around to being funny again. Like another famous example of that is the sketch Kristen Schaal is a Horse, if you want to look it up on YouTube. Hilarious for a minute or 2 minutes, right? Hilarious. Yeah. Then 5 minutes where you're angry about it. And then suddenly it becomes funny again on like minute 7. And you're like, how is this funny again? It's a weird thing how time as part of the mix into comedy plays a part with running gags.
Well, at this point, and speaking of that video, I would love to see the analytics of that video to see how many people stop watching the video at the angry part.
Absolutely.
And never make it. And that's why we've got to take a pause here and say that everything that we're talking about so far, in my opinion, is very, very rooted in newspaper comic strips and print comic books to a certain extent. There are running gags in those. When we're talking about comics that are building their audience on the web, running gags, I would warn you against them because you need a established audience for a running gag because the running gag assumes that you saw the earlier run. It gets all of its energy because the audience says, oh, it's this again, right?
Right.
And if you're building an audience and if your main audience is on the web, you know that until you have a very established audience, a lot of the people are seeing your stuff for the very first time. Yeah. And that running gag is going to not only fall flat, it's going to hurt your audience building abilities because since they don't understand the previous, they just see that as a joke that fell flat. They don't get it because they needed to read the comic from last Tuesday or 10 Tuesdays ago to get it. I would really, really caution most of our listenership against leaning on a running gag.
You're right. In that a newspaper audience was a captured audience. You had a fixed percentage of that audience every day, day in, day out, kind of whether they liked it or not. They got
absolutely
Mother Goose and Grimm, whether they wanted it or not. So eventually people just started reading it, which is why you got in the 90s, you had delightful websites of people hate reading X, Y, or Z. Didn't matter what, because they were captured audiences. So you're right. The familiarity is important. But what's interesting here and something we haven't talked about is that the familiarity is also one of the weapons that a running gag uses in that it may not be as funny as it was the first time. It may not be as funny as it was the second time the running gag was used. But something about a running gag triggers a different emotional response than humor, which is the joy of familiarity, of like, I know what this is. I'm in the in group. But also, life has patterns, and here is one of the patterns, and I see the pattern coming, but I'm still enjoying it, which is different, I would argue, Brad, than comedy, don't you think?
Yeah, so when we talk about comedy, the first thing that we always say is that one of the primary drivers of comedy is surprise, right? And we really bear down on that, especially if you listen to us in the writer's room episodes. We're looking for the surprise. We're looking for the most surprising thing to happen. If you go into the Comic Lab Discord and you put your stuff up in the critique channel, a lot of times people who are struggling with humor writing, what I'll do, and very often I'll just tear this down and say, you gave us a character that was given this situation, and your response to that situation or the character's response that you wrote is exactly what you would expect that character to do. And as a result, it's not surprising, and therefore it's not funny. And a lot of humor that falls down, you can apply that to. You gave us a situation, and very often they give us a character that reacts the way you'd expect a character to react, and it's not surprising because that drains all the humor out of it. To your point, it's really interesting. A running gag, if you can assume either an established audience or a trapped audience. A running gag gets all of its energy charge from a non-surprise. In other words, it's not a surprise that the panda jumps out and attacks somebody because we've seen it before. So in that respect, it's not surprising. The surprise is how it was applied this time.
Yes, right? What new wrinkle could be brought to it, or
So it's kind of a non-surprise surprise. It's not a surprise. I've seen the attacking panda before, but it is a surprise in like, oh, I wasn't expecting it this time.
Yes. By the way, that's a really good construction. I'm really glad you pointed that out to give it back, to bring us back to the bare bones construction of what are the building blocks of humor. Surprise being a big one. How does a running gag work in that? And don't get me wrong, I am not poo-pooing running gags. I use them myself. I love them. I think they're great. Brad, not so sure about running gags.
Well, no. What name? I don't want to put you on the spot because I'm sitting here. For me, I feel as if maybe I would have a running gag. I don't know what my running gag would be. Like, I don't know that I use a running gag per se, but maybe I'm too close to it. Like, I don't consciously use a running gag.
Well, you definitely over the course of your career have had tropish settings.
Mm-hmm.
Like you very much leaned in on Lightning Lady answering phones, the construction of which those jokes was a one-sided conversation, which crafts a very specific kind of writing style, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
Again, that's more tropish than running gaggish, and more setting-ish than running gaggish, but it's still, I would argue, a running gag.
And it was done back when I was positioning Evil Inc. as a newspaper comic strip. That was I was still self-syndicated. Since I switched over to Evil Inc. as a graphic novel in 2016, I think I've had maybe one or two of those. But you are right. It's just that it hasn't happened since I stopped thinking about this as a newspaper comic.
We're not emotionally opposed to them, even though we don't use them very often. I don't know that I've ever had one that was tremendously successful that I was like, well, I've always got this one in my bag, that kind of thing. I will say in Drive, my science fiction graphic novel, I do have a running gag where I have this one species of aliens called Vetans, and they are voracious eaters. And it's more of a go-to joke anytime I need levity, that anytime food is introduced into conversation or the topic at hand, the Vetans go nuts about food. And then I have another species called Philopods who, like, all of their core essence is about the creation of art, right? Or the consuming or creation of art. They're big on it. And the dumber the art form, dance or, interpretive dance or slam poetry, the more useless that it is, the more they get excited about it. Yeah. That's kind of a running gag, is that, like, in the midst of some terrible crisis, they'll be like, hold on, let me just crank out this quick bit of slam poetry real quick. Yeah. And so it's not so much a running gag in a big visual, which is how a lot of people think of a running gag. It's a running gag in more of a verbal sense, which I would argue is still a running gag. I can see you questioning that. Do you think of a running gag as literally a physical pratfall or a physicality, or do you not allow for a verbal visual running gag?
Everything that you just described, I would characterize as character-driven comedy, right?
Yes, but if it's recurring by a specific trigger, is that not a running gag?
It's part of its character.
All right, you might be right. No, you might be right. I'm saying immediately, you might be right.
Here's what I think of as a running gag. A running gag, verbally, let me take that into a verbal standpoint. A running gag.
So is it only a running gag is only an externality? It's not from a character itself. Is that what you're thinking?
Okay, and I'm trying to shape my thinking. This is one of those things that you think you know what the answer is until you start talking, and then it's
talking out of my ass. Maybe I don't know.
This isn't quite the thing yet. A running gag is like a punchline that your audience can say with you because they heard it so many times They know have you ever heard, I'm going all the way back to old time radio, Jack Benny kind of stuff, right?
Right.
There are certain punchlines that like the entire cast says at the same time because it happens so many times. Everybody knows.
It's the version of Take My Wife, Please kind of
It's a version of Third Base.
Yeah.
Not Take My Wife, Please, which is, again, a concept.
How about Niagara Falls? That's also
yes. It's a version of Third Base where it's who's on first, what's on second, blah, 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 blah. At some point, third base has come up so often that it's a running gag. And at one point, Abbott and Costello says third base at the same time because they both know it's going to happen. Why? Because it's a running gag.
Yeah.
That third base is a running gag to me.
In the song equivalent, I think, is the phrase 5 golden rings. Which in and amongst that terrible song that I don't know why we still sing it, but when we get to 5 golden rings, everybody goes 5 golden rings because it's the one part of the running gag of that joke or that song that you know.
Right.
And maybe what you're saying is that the running gag is the familiarity that lets you chime in as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, like in South Park, Kenny dies. What happens as soon as Kenny dies? What do you say?
What is it? You bastards? I haven't watched South Park in forever.
You bastards, you killed Kenny.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the audience can say it along because it's a running gag.
Right.
And the only reason the audience knows is because they've already watched all those previous episodes. Again, I'm going to caution our audience against this because unless you've got a really well-established audience, because the only reason that works is because it was episodic TV and then it works. It's not going to work for me doing audience building on the web because the person that sees it that first time, they're not going to get it, or at least they're not going to get the same level of charge out of it.
So what makes that not a character moment for, what's the character's name? Kyle? Because it's always Kyle that says it, right, on South Park? Why is that not a character moment? Why is that a running gag? Do you see what I'm asking?
Because when you're saying you've got a philopod that always likes wacky art, that happens in a number of different iterations throughout Drive. It's dance one time, it's pottery the next, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kenny dying is the same thing that happens, and it's the same line that gets read every time. You bastards, you killed Kenny, or those bastards, they killed Kenny. And again, it comes at the end where the gag happens. You're talking about setup. I'm talking about punchline. Does that? And by the way, I could be wrong too, but that's the way I've got it formulating in my head.
I have a separate running gag again involving philopods where the leader of the philopod planet, right? He's I forget what he is, the first minister or prime minister, whatever they call him. But every time that they walk into his private office, he is doing some form of ridiculous art and is embarrassed by it. So at one point, he's carving a sculpture of himself in marble. And another point, he's like composing a song on classical Spanish guitar. Another song, he's painting something. And he's always like, I'm doing serious business. Also, please knock when you come in. You know, it's like that kind. That to me is a running gag, but it's more procedural, not punchline, you know?
And that feels more like a running gag to me, especially if that sounds running gag. It would seal the deal if there are certain phrases or words that happen every time he gets caught.
Well, it's always some version of, I'm doing serious work and also please knock, you know, that kind of thing. Like
that starts to feel like a running gag to me.
Yeah. But
you see what I'm saying?
Okay, all of this gets to, I think, my final point that I want to make about the use or not use of running gags, which is there is a huge amount of subjectivity that every artist has to bring to their own use or non-use or repeated use of running gags, right? So when I go back to the well, basically, which is kind of whether you want to call it a running gag in comics or a runner in a sitcom, and a runner is different than a running gag, so don't confuse them, but they are of similar ilk. Whether you're doing a runner or a running gag or a repeated situational theme or a repeated character moment, all of them rely on your editorial eye as a cartoonist, your subjective take, like, does this make me laugh? Does this work for me?
Yeah.
And then you filter it through a second filter, which is, yes, it works for me. Okay, I'm going to do it. But wait a minute. is it too much for the audience? Have I gone to this well too much? And that's a second consideration that a seasoned cartoonist also includes in their formulation of like, yeah, okay, it makes me laugh, but am I going to drive a bunch of people nuts? Or, and that is a second consideration that I think it's nebulous, it's gray area, it's subjective, and it's hard to call for Brad. But if Brad might be like, to hell with Dave's opinion, I'm going all in on this. I love this. I'm doing it again,
When it's like a chef or somebody more specifically in a culinary school.
A chef is a great example. Yes.
How much salt should I use? When does a running gag lose its humor? Is exactly like somebody in a culinary school saying, how much salt should I use? The answer is you have to develop a sense of taste.
Right.
You have to, and good taste, right? And what a comedian learns is to read the room. Is this joke still funny? Is this losing its steam? Reading your audience, reading the room, developing taste. That's right. We can argue what a running gag is, and it's a fun philosophical conversation. In fact, as you were talking, I thought about probably the one that I think is the best example, and that is the TV series Arrested Development had a whole slew of running gags, right? For example, somebody would say, "You're chicken," and the running gag, which each of them had a different sound effect for chicken. And at one point, the main character says, "Hey, have you guys ever heard a chicken before?" Right? And they've all got different dances. And Tobias and the Blue Man Group, there's a bunch of, you really want a master's class in running gags, Arrested Development.
That show was brilliant. Again, that show might be one of the funniest shows ever written. Absolutely.
Too smart for the room, but brilliant. Like I could see why it didn't go for, 10 seasons. But oh my God, the most insanely brilliant writing. I agree. I think it's probably one of the best of all time. But if you really, but again, I'm going to stop and say episodic TV, not a lot that applies to me as a cartoonist on the web. But this actually leads us right into another question that I've had in the hopper for a little while.
Okay.
And I got to throw it out there because it fits in so nicely. We're talking about learning your seasoning, learning your taste. We had a very nice Patreon backer who's asked us this question, and you're going to see how it dovetails right now. Lauren says, I've been listening to Comic Lab for a few years now because it's just so entertaining, even though it's been several decades since I've made any attempts at my own comics. Comic Lab as absorbing for consumers as it is for creators, Lauren says. Recently, I've learned that I need to tackle my own comics project again. So I finally have a question of my own. Do you have any practical tips on how to go about developing one's editorial eye? I am under no illusions that the stuff I can do now is any good, but I'm not sure how to make it better. I've started digging in the archives of artists I admire in order to observe their style changes over the years, but it's often hard for me to pinpoint exactly what the difference is. Do you have any advice, book recommendations, pro tips episodes? Thanks for all your great work over the years, and I hope to get more for years to come. Lauren. So Lauren, the basic question there, and it's from the standpoint of a beginner who says, I want to do my own comic. I know I need an editorial eye. How do I develop an editorial eye?
Well, there's, Lauren, you're on the right path. There's two sides to developing an editorial eye. One is the consumer side, and one is the creating side. And the truth is, and it's not particularly a happy thought, is time is the third element of that. Yeah. Time and repeated effort is the third element. And so absolutely, you're on the right page. Read your heroes, read your peers, read the people that do incredible work. Drill down into why this panel transition worked, why that one didn't. Why does this page flip so engaging? Why is that page flip not engaging? Really think about, as you're consuming, what's working and why it's working and what tools they're employing. At the same time, you'll be creating your own thing, and you'll be working out what you want to say, how you want to say it, the way you want to say it. But as Brad said in reference to stand-up comedians, you'll also be reading the room. You'll be seeing what's getting a response. And I don't know if you've ever gone, Lauren, to see a stand-up comedian. In the U.S., one of the things that you can always tell is when you see them at like the Comedy Store or something, or you go to, I'm trying to think of ones on the East Coast. But anyway, if you go to the Comedy Store and you see like Jim Gaffigan, right? And he's not quite at an hour yet. He's like at 45 minutes, but he's going to do 45 minutes at the Comedy Store. And you can tell that what he's doing is he's building up an hour for his HBO show. But it's not a polished 45 minutes yet because he's actively reading the room to see what's working. And the next time he performs, the joke that you heard about the horse will be cut, or it will be lengthened and turned into a runner, or because it got such a big response, you know?
Yeah.
And so someone like Gaffigan, in terms of building up an hour show, is reading the room to see what works. And as a cartoonist, you'll be doing the same over the next 5 to 10 years. You'll be reading the room of what reactions you get from your audience. And in so doing, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you'll be able to produce something that you know will land, even though no one has seen this yet before, because you've read the room over hundreds of previous comic installations and saw what worked. Am I wrong about that, Brad?
You're 100% right. My answer to this question, is there a book I can read to help develop my editorial eye? And the answer is no, there's not a book you can read. You have to read all of the books. That's where you get your editorial eye.
Yes.
Not by reading one how-to book, but by reading every collection of comics that you can get your hand on and reading it with a critical eye, paying attention to why choices were made every step along the way, not just accepting them, not just, and that's why I always recommend, same thing with any video content that you're trying to get information out of as a creator. Read it through, watch it twice. First time for the actual content, for the experience, and then immediately read it through a second time.
Right.
And ask yourself, why are decisions being made the way they're being made? Why they do this? And my other favorite advice to give, and I gave this to my storytelling class at UArts all the time, as important as it is to read great works of literature or watch amazing TV series like Arrested Development, it is equally, if not a little bit more important, to read crap, to read stuff that by people who are also at the beginning stage, or people that are maybe been doing this for 10 years, but they just haven't been paying attention, and they have not been, improving, and they just spinning their wheels.
Right.
Any number of reasons why it's not great stuff. And you can learn volumes by saying that didn't work at all. Yeah. And then that light should go off in your head. Okay, why didn't it work? Why is this panel not working? Why is this sequence not working? Why am I reacting this way? Reading crap, and believe me, there's a lot. You can find it pretty easy. Reading crap is a really, really important way of saying to yourself, I didn't like that, and here's how I think we could do it better.
Right. And that extends to all sorts of culture that you consume. So like if you read, like if you're told in school, Herman Melville was a genius and Moby Dick is a genius, and then you read Moby Dick and you're like, holy hell, this is too verbose and the diction is horrible and confusing. And we got 4 pages on the construction of a sail. I can't stand this. And then you read like Vonnegut and it's like rat-a-tat-tat machine gun language. And you're like, this is so much more effective. And so even the greats are instructive in how they can fail miserably. Like Moby Dick is a terrible book in a lot of respects. Yeah. And so like, even though it's held up as one of the great American bits of American literature, and yes, great, it was, but it's, when you read even the people that you are told are great, and we can include all sorts of comic cartoonists in that you're told that they're great, but they're not your flavor of great. And that starts to inform your editorial eye of what you want to create, what you want to put out into the world. They often say, write the story you want to read. And by reading a bunch of comics, some of which you're like, this is not good stuff. This is not what I want to be held up as the greatest of comics. You'll start to put out the stuff that you want to see in the world.
Oh, you just lit me right up like a candle, because so I do these comics consultations, right? Where I go one-on-one with somebody and just talk to them on a Zoom conference for an hour about their specific comics and give them some thoughts on how they can improve. I was doing one with a really nice guy, a very good artist. And understandably, he was writing this thing about cowboys, and he was writing out phonetically a traditional cowboy accent.
Right.
I done come to this here place, you vomits, and vomits was VAHMINTS, right?
Vomits,
Not
yeah,
varmint,
yep.
but vomits. Yep. And by the way, I'm not making fun. I see where he was going. I see what he was trying to do. He was trying to spell out all it, and it was literally, Dave, every other word.
Right.
Because he was thorough, right? And so I said, okay, here's the deal. This is really hard to read. And it didn't, I wish I had done this with him during the time. But later on, I was reading a copy of Hogan Alley magazine, right? We were talking about that a couple episodes ago. And he had, and it was a great issue that talked about when Frank Frazetta was working on Al Cap's comic strip. If you remember, Lil Abner. And if you go back and read Lil Abner, it's all done exactly the same way.
Yes.
It's got this, it's very exaggerated accent that he's spelling out phonetically.
Mm-hmm.
Lil Abner is almost impossible to read. It's the same thing as...
Oh, it's inscrutable. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, Herman Melville, for his time, wrote a brilliant book. Lil Abner, for its time, was a brilliant comic strip. And again, here's another theme. He also had a trapped audience. They were stuck there with that newspaper comics page, and they didn't have the choice of scrolling past. If they wanted to read Lil Abner, they had to sit there and force themselves to translate that word balloon by word balloon. But in reading Lil Abner, you see what a terrible experience as a reader that is, especially for today's readers who have so many choices. So then by reading Lil Abner, you can teach yourself, okay, I can see maybe putting a little zhuzh in there. I can see putting maybe one or two accent words. I actually gave this guy 8 different strategies he could use that had nothing to do with writing out phonetics to get the same kind of output.
Mm-hmm.
By reading Lil Abner, you can learn acres and acres of information on how not to write dialogue.
I'm going to jump in on this because in the past I've criticized Pogo for very similar reasons. Again, called them mad about it, but I will stand firm on this, is that Pogo was brilliant for what it tried to do when it started in 1948 before television, which is it tried to express American regionalisms and American accents with both weird font choices and weird word choices like Little Abner did. Yep. And I'll say it again, before television, because when TV came along, it did it better. So literature at that point, when Little Abner and Pogo came around, had hundreds of years of having to express regionalisms and accents through the written word because there was no better way to do it. So if you wanted to write a Scottish accent, you had to write out, and you had to write it in the weird sort of way that you'll see a Scottish accent written out. Mm-hmm. It's so much better. TV just does it better, right? And so you found comic strips drop that whole angle completely because everyone was like, this was always unreadable, but it was the best we had. Now TV does it better. So what Pogo started with in 1948, by the time it got to, I don't know, the early 70s, when did Pogo end?
I'm going to say around 70s, yeah.
It was a tired trope. It was really tired and visually was exhausting to read. And Little Abner was exhausting to read because TV did it better. It's basically, that's the only tool we had at that time was the written word. So in 1948, that's what you did with Pogo. And in 1928, that's what you did with Little Abner, whenever Little Abner started. And so when did Little Abner start, by the way? Was that in the 30s?
Oh, I'm going to say 30s, yeah. Okay. I don't know off the top of my head.
But you get what I'm going with here is that there was no better tool in the tool shed. So that's what you did in a comic strip, you know?
I'm going to take your brilliant thoughts and add one more layer to them.
Okay.
And here's what I'm going to say. It was part of the gag back then. Right?
Yes.
And I'm going to throw in one more. There was a very, very charming comic strip called Rose is Rose.
Yes.
And the whole idea was that they had this little kid. He was a toddler and he would do toddler speak. right? And it would be written out phonetically the way a toddler would say, I want spaghetti. Oh, their little, what was his name? Ezekiel or something.
Yeah, Family Circus did that too. Yeah,
the little boy wants spaghetti. And the whole gag was translating and interpreting, and the surprise came from, oh, that's what he's saying. Lil Abner, Pogo, Rose is Rose, those all relied on the same kind of translation hook of, oh, now I've translated it. Now I understand it. Surprise. That's what they're saying, which was great, again, for a newspaper audience. What I'm saying is for today's audience, you're not going to get somebody work that hard to read your stuff.
That's
They're going to scroll right
work.
past you. Audience. Again, I've said this to students and they bristle, but we have a much shorter attention span now than we used to. And if you ever doubt that, just try to watch a movie from the 1960s. You'll pull your hair out. It's slow. It's a slow paced because your attention span is different than it was if you were in the 1960s.
Absolutely. What is this TV show that you love where the guy goes, one more thing? And he's always got the...
Columbo.
Columbo. Okay.
Yes.
So Columbo, Chips, all those sort of shows from the 60s, 70s, you watch the editing on that, like car pulls up, exterior shot, door opens, person steps out of the car, walks 30 feet to the door, walks into the door. Now interior shot, they walk from the front door to the stair, go up the stairs, hallway shot, and they now walk from the top of that hallway down the hall into the door, and then they go, now one more thing. Modern television, the editing would be like one cut, exterior shot, smash cut into the room where you're going to take the scene place. So that's part of your editorial eye, is sort of reading the room of what audiences will accept, you know? I used
to play one Columbo episode every semester, just for that reason, because at the end of that episode, they'd be fit to be tied. Yeah. And they'd say, oh my God, that's so slow. And I'd say, now let's talk about why you said that. Because that's that's part of the reason. I want to expose people to Peter Falk, and Columbo in general. But that's the whole reason I showed him that, is that it proves, and if you want to capture an audience today, you cannot, and it's a mistake we see people making all the time. You can't say, well, Jim Davis did this, so I'm going to do it. Jim Davis made his bones in a completely different landscape. You can't do what Jim Davis did. You can't, and it's also equally dangerous to take what a stand-up comedian does. They made their bones on the stage. You're not doing that. It's really dicey. It's really dicey to try to build an audience today, and you've got to build an audience that exists today.
But here's where your insights will increase with time as you're reading your peers and professionals, and you're creating yourself. Is you'll say like, okay, no, Jim Davis made his bank in a very different medium expression of comic strips in newspapers. Absolutely. Granted that. But what can I take away from Jim Davis? Okay, if I want a certain kind of delivery and a certain kind of audience growth, I can use minimal word count in my comic strip. There's something Davis told us once. It was something like 35 words or less is always a Garfield, right? Who else does that? Sarah Scribbles does that brilliantly. Yes. Word count is always below 30 words. It's a very specific kind of comic strip. It's very different from, say, like David Malky Wondermark, which has 100 plus words in it, you know? And so your editorial eye is what will audiences accept? What kind of audience am I cultivating for? How do I want to create? And so you only get that by continuously reading all sorts of stuff, all sorts of comics and outside of comics, and creating. And so it's not a satisfying answer in the sense that you pull a lever and the thing happens. You pull 100 levers over the next decade, and slowly a thing will happen. And that being, you'll develop your editorial eye.
And the last step is get honest feedback on your work and listen to it. The first part is hard enough. The second part, most people find downright impossible. But get objective feedback on your work, and then have the strength to listen to it. Right? I've seen people get good advice and go, well, I'm emotionally invested, so I'm going to do it anyway.
This itself is its own tricky little landmine because sometimes the feedback you'll be given with all best intentions is not right for what you're trying to create. Sometimes it's perfectly right for what you're trying to create, and you don't yet have the strength to say, you know what, they're right.
Yeah.
So even that requires an editorial finesse that you will develop over time. Like if Brad, with all love in his heart, tells me, Dave, here's, like, pulls me aside and be like, listen, this thing you're doing in Drive, it's not working. You got to do X, Y, Z. And he might be right for the way that Brad Guigar would want to create Drive. You know what I mean? And the thing that I might tell Brad about Evil Inc. would be right if it was Dave Kellett creating Evil Inc.
Yeah.
And so part of it is being able in time to discern good feedback from bad and whether the feedback itself is right for the way you want to create your comic. And I'll give you one example just as an offhanded mark.
Yeah.
When Sheldon first got started, and you can go back to the beginning archive or Google it, the first decade or so of my lettering, I think both Brad and Chris Straub pulled me aside and said, like, hey, your lettering's good, but why do you have the first letter of every word be a fourth or a third bigger than every other capital letter in that word?
You were lettering in all caps. I remember this.
I was lettering in all caps, but the first letter, remember, was bigger.
Yeah.
And
there's a word for that. I got it right. But yeah, smart, tall caps, smart. Yeah, go.
It's tall caps, but title case was, you know what I mean? Like it's hard to explain. It's both.
You're doing a better job before I interrupted you. Keep
but
going.
Anyway, you get the idea. It was all caps, but the first letter of every word was just a little bit taller, right?
Yeah.
And I thought it was my own clever take on lettering. And I had both readers and a couple trusted friends say to me, sometimes with all good love, like Brad might have said, I don't remember what he actually said, but he might have said something like, hey, why do you do it that way? What's going on there? And to me, I thought I was being clever and unique. And there are certain things that are just clever by half. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's worthwhile to be clever, but the reason why lettering works is because it's an instrument of communication delivery, not that because itself is window dressing. You know what I mean? And there's a couple people I could point to right now that with their lettering, they're too clever by half. They do their R's in a weird way, or they do their dotted I's. And it's just like, it distracts from what lettering is supposed to be, which is instantaneous and clear communication from the artist to the reader.
Yeah.
And so anyway, what I'm getting by that is that it took both me realizing they were right, and it also took readers and friends telling me, hey, maybe you're wrong here to do it this way. But I've also had people with perhaps good intention on my part that said, hey, Dave, you're maybe the wrong artist to draw Drive. And I go back to that one because I use that with so much spite to be like, F you, I'm drawing Drive and I'm going to make it a great comic. And so was that given with all good faith? It might have been. Were they right? And maybe in their mind for how they would have drawn Drive, maybe they were. If I'm being generous, maybe they were right. But I had to have my own editorial eye to say, no, this is the way that I'm going to create Drive. It's going to be a different kind of science fiction comic strip or comic graphic novel. And no, this is the right way to do it. So that comes with time, with repeated effort, with concerted focus on taking in as much comics as I wanted to take in, as I needed to take in, reading voluminously, and creating, at that point in my career, on a daily level, such that I could see where I wanted to go and start to see how to get there. Hey, gang, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we'll tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
Yeah, because when you do, you'll get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on Comic Lab topics.
And you'll get access to our exclusive Discord server, a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And ho Nelly, if you want even more comics goodness in your life, check out the new drawing show that we're doing with our pal Kevin McShane over at wrongwayshow.com. That's wrongwayshow.com.
In each episode, we'll show you how to draw your favorite cartoon characters the wrong way.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. Well, Brad, this was supposed to come mid-show, but we had such a fun run there that the update for this week is coming at the end of the show.
Yeah.
But I wanted to specifically talk about San Diego Comic-Con because having just wrapped up my corporate taxes, in a way that I should have had in July, but I'm just having now. Yeah. I have my final numbers for my costs for San Diego Comic-Con and my income for San Diego Comic-Con. And I thought I would share it because I think it's worthwhile, because when Brad and I say we don't recommend Comic-Cons, a lot of people will be like, yeah, but Dave goes to San Diego Comic-Con.
Right.
And I'll tell you why. Specifically, it's because there's enough money in it for me, and my family lives there, and I get to see a lot of hometown friends and all that sort of stuff. So I thought it would be interesting to share that I had $4,800 of expenses for San Diego Comic-Con, the bulk of which was the booth, which I think was $3,900 last year, $4,000 last year is a lot. So I have a nice corner booth. People that see it are always like, oh, wow, how'd you get this kind of thing? So it's a nice booth, $4,800. But on that, I had $15,000 of gross income. So it was roughly a $2,000 a day net profit for the 5 days of Comic-Con. So you take that, plus the fact that San Diego Comic-Con is fun for me, plus I'm seeing my family, plus I'm seeing a bunch of high school friends.
Yeah.
That's why I do San Diego. But it's because those numbers work out. If I had a net gain of 0 per day, or God forbid, a net loss and I have had those shows, New York Comic-Cons or TCAFs in Canada, or you name the Comic-Con, I might have tried it in the early 2000s. That's why Brad and I don't do those shows anymore, because they don't bring off enough money for the effort. And in some cases, you lose money.
And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about herd mentality. Comic conventions is a great example of herd mentality. There was a time when going to a comic convention was a high revenue income stream. It was something that you could do. It was something that you maybe even in the early 2000s had to do because it was pre-social media. So going to a comic convention was very important. And so then that information starts circulating. You got to go to a comic convention. And it gets said again, because that's what you heard, and you heard it because that's what everybody said. Long after it ceases to be true, it still gets said. You got to go to a comic convention. You got to go there to network. You got to do this. You got to do that. Long after, like I finally jumped off in 2017, where I said, and I made a post on it on webcomics.com. It's time to be honest with ourselves. We're not making money at these things. There's a few of us who are. There's a few people who have changed their business. You saw the wall of prints become very, very prominent. You've seen a number of those things. But for people like us who are doing comics, this has long since stopped being profitable. We got to stop doing it. And my business flourished after I stopped going to comic conventions. At this point, I'm like Dave. Dave will go to San Diego. I'm doing 2 this year, and the only reason I'm going is that I can practically walk to the venue. The NCS is going to have a booth. I'm not paying nickel number one. I'm going to hang out with a bunch of cartooning friends like Jamar and hang out with people I really like. And I'll bring a box of books, plunk them down. If they sell, they sell. If not, I'll get a chance to chew the fat with some of my friends. And that's it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing these shows anymore. Right. And it's really important to be, again, to fight that herd mentality that is actually hurting people. It hurts a lot.
I see what you did there. Oh my God.
I'm telling you, I've become so fascinated with rhetoric. Herd mentality hurts, right? Because you
Hey,
get
Brad,
caught
can I
up.
just say, I've heard you. I heard you, my friend. You heard what he said about herd mentality hurting. So come on, everybody. The English language. Let's celebrate it. What a playground. What a playground. The English language. No, I want to say 2 things to that. Number one, I am envious that you get to spend a day boothing with Jamar Nicholas, because he's one of my favorite people. He just exudes joy. He's just a joy-filled human being. Secondly, yes, to echo Brad's thought, the reason why I do San Diego Comic-Con and I don't do New York Comic-Con, for example, is New York Comic-Con is a $400 flight for me. It's also 4 to 5 nights of a hotel in New York, which is what does that average? $200 a night?
Manhattan? You're talking 4 digits at least.
Yeah, so $1,000 to $1,500 for hotel, $400 for a flight, a couple thousand at least for a booth at New York Comic Con, if not multiple thousands. And then the union cost because I'm not allowed to bring my own books in. That always makes me laugh that the union's like, no, we're going to do that for you, sir. That'll be $200. And so also shipping a couple 100 pounds of books, that's a couple $100 more. So you can see why I'm like, shine it. I'm not spending 5 days in New York. Right. And then every meal is $600 because it's like even McDonald's is a $400 Big Mac because it's Manhattan. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. You know what? The reason why they say it is because you can't make it there. New York is ridiculous. So what I'm getting at, though, is I wanted to say this because I wanted to reinforce for everyone that the only reason I do San Diego is that it's a very specific economic set of circumstances that I can physically drive down a shit ton of stuff into pack that booth, make a ton of money there. My only cost is the booth. I don't have to pay. It's now that I have the electric car, it'll be even less. Brad, it's going to be the only show I do probably for the foreseeable future. I can see, though, maybe when my kids go to college, just for funsies, just to get out of the house, I may do a couple of shows again that were borderline profitable. Emerald City Comic Con always brought in a few thousand of profit. Maybe that'll be worth it again when my kids are not in the house anymore, just so I can go up to Seattle, see David Malky, see a bunch of friends up there. Can't you see yourself as the kids move out, maybe doing some just to get out of the house?
Yeah, maybe. I would almost like if that came around, I would go back to Comic Lab across America, that idea. And instead of doing conventions, we would just do like comic shops and personal signings at different places.
Yes.
That to me sounds like so much more fun.
You're right.
Rent an RV. Could you see us just driving down the road, you and me in the RV, you trying to look for places where they've got discounts on pants. And just driving.
Brad just cussing at everyone as he drives. Just Brad behind the wheel of a 10-ton vehicle, just cussing, just letting out decades of anger on the road. Oh.
And you know, one of the things that I might yell at one of these Subaru drivers that's driving too slow in the far left lane. Yes, You know what I might yell at him? I might yell at him something profane like this. You've been listening to Comic Lab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Oh, see, this is why I heard your herd on herding mentality. That's great. Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evilcomic.com and the new co-host of The Wrong Way Show over at wrongwayshow.com.
And my friend Dave Kellett, the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drive.com. I got all excited because I knew what I was going to say next. And Drive at drivecomic.com and the new co-host of wrongwayshow.com showing up every Thursday, I think now. We've got a little something new on that Patreon page on the regular. And oh man, if you're not over there, you're missing out.
I love it. And the Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by the ever wonderful Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab.
That was such a senior moment to hear the crinkle of the paper.
Hold on. Because I got a review.
Hold on, let Grandpa find his glasses,
there we
everybody.
Go.
Hold on.
I got to look over my glasses. Yeah, so I can say if you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. You may hear your review featured on a future episode like this one. David, listen to this. Got another review on Apple Podcasts. After what felt like years where nobody was reviewing the show, finally some of these folks got around to giving us a little 5-star review. Listen to this. Good info, funny people. This comes in from Gary Scott Beatty, who says, full of useful information presented by cartoonists with historical perspective and true creative and marketing experience. The best reason to subscribe is they're good people having fun talking together, and it shows. 2 of my all-time favorite podcasts.
Ah, that's great. I love
Thank you so much,
I love
Gary.
how they mentioned historical perspective because we've just spent the episode crapping on Pogo and Little Al.
Yeah, well, no take-backs. No take backs.
Yeah, exactly. We stand by what we said. And Comic Lab is made possible by your support at patreon.com/Comic Lab. So I'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/I challenge you to read Pogo.
small caps. It's called small caps. What you were lettering in, not all caps, not tall caps. The fontological term for it is small caps. It's been bothering me, so I had to Google it while you were talking.
Wait, okay, hold on. It's called, first of all, I did not know that there was a phrase called fontological. That's fantastic. I genuinely thank you for teaching. Oh, you made it up? I thought it was real. Okay, I'm now sticking with fontological. Yeah. That's fantastic because it sounds like ontological. So the fontological argument, I'm really enjoying this. The fontological argument is small caps, and what is a small cap? Now I'm confused.
It's what you used to letter in. It's all caps, but the first letter of every word was a taller small cap or a tall. So it looked like capitalization, but it wasn't because all the letters were capitalized.
I have never used it described. You're right. I just Googled it while you were talking. There is a thing called small caps, and that's what I used, and it still doesn't work. That's my.
Now you know the word for your failure.